Yud Bey, so all the way up to Hillel and Shammai. What imported historically is Hillel and Shammai are about, Hillel begins about 20, 30 years BCE. And during Hillel and Shammai's leadership of the Sanhedrin felt that they didn't have control, that their punishments and decrees weren't listened to. So so it says 40 years before the destruction of the temple, which would be about 28 BCE, the Sanhedrin left the Lishkat HaGazos. At that point, that meant that the Sanhedrin no longer had the statutory authority to decide things, to decide laws. The laws got decided by a majority of votes when they got together, which wasn't that often. So Hillel and Shammai disputed, I believe, about 6 or 7 things, but their students, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, had many disputes about a whole range of things. And that's where we are. So this is really where the unitary tradition ends, and it's really from Hillel and Shammai you begin to get different opinions in the Mishnah. So Hillel and Shammai Kibbul Mehem. Hillel and Shammai received from Shemayan of Talyon. Hillel said, and of course Hillel is quoted many times in Pirke Avot. Hillel is a very significant figure. Now, a little bit of background, that Hillel was from Bavel. He was Hillel HaBabli. He was from Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia had always a large Jewish community, but the primary centers of Torah study had been in Israel, and this was the case really till not just till the destruction of the temple, but really till after the Bar Kokhba revolt. So Hillel had come to the land of Israel to learn, and there are many famous stories about him. Quite famously, he made his living chopping wood. There was a doorman at the academy who would charge a penny to get in. So Hillel would use a penny to live on and give him a penny to get in. One day he didn't make enough to give him the penny, so he climbed up onto the roof to listen through the skylight, which was an open light, an open hole. And it was cold and snowy, and all of a sudden, they said, it got dark all of a sudden, and they realized there was a figure of a person on the skylight, and Hillel had passed out from the cold. So they brought him down, and they removed the doorkeeper. But to make a long story short, Hillel quickly emerged as a major figure, and as a matter of fact, after Shemayan of Talyon, there were 2 students of theirs, the Bnei Beseira, the children of Beseira, who maintained the position, and of leading the Sanhedrin. And they once had a problem they couldn't solve, and Hillel engaged in a novel exegesis that solved the problem. So they stepped down from their position and gave it to Hillel. And Hillel was famously very patient and very loving, and there are many stories about him. But at any rate, Hillel and Shammai Kibbul Mehem, they received from Shemayan of Talyon. Hillel said, Havei mitamidav shel Aaron, be of the students of Aaron, Ohev Shalom, who loved peace, Rodev Shalom, and pursued peace, Umakarvam the Torah, and drew them close to the Torah. Quite simply, that to love peace is obvious. To pursue peace means you don't simply sit back and lament that there's no peace, but as the story goes, that if 2 people were quarreling, Aaron would go to one and say, your friend really wants to make up with you but doesn't know how, say the same to the other, and engineer a pershmat. In other words, pursuing peace means that you don't just declare that it's a good thing, you don't just love it, you also are willing to go through whatever lengths necessary to bring peace. Secondly, now the and last of all, he loved people and brings them close to the Torah. Now, we'll get to these two last in a moment because these are actually very important. But I think we should raise an obvious question. Throughout the Pirke Avot, we talk about characteristics that are ideal, moral, and ethical characteristics, and we say this is good and this is not good, do this and do that. Why does Hillel feel driven to introduce be of the students of Aaron? I mean, it may be true that these were Aaron's characteristics, so this belongs in a midrash on some verse about Aaron. But in the Mishnah, where the words are counted and we're interested in the topic, and obviously many of the qualities we discussed here were exemplified by Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or Judah or whoever, and we don't mention their names. So the question is, what is Hillel adding by articulating that this is the path of Aaron? He has to be adding something or there's no point in saying it. Again, simply cataloging which biblical figure had which quality is not something that Pirke Avot typically does. So what do you think?
Maybe there was so much confrontation at this point that he needed a major figure.
Right, but then you could say this about many things. In other words, this point in history, Hillel appears many more times. He doesn't always quote a person.
You have to find something to learn out from the citation of Aaron that isn't already apparent from the fact that you're supposed to love peace and pursue
Exactly.
peace.
Precisely.
So what did Aaron do besides loving and pursuing peace?
Or why don't we ask the question, who was Aaron? What were Aaron's other obligations?
So he did it even though he had a different job.
That's a possibility. That's how the Lubavitcher Rebbe probes it. He suggests, look, this man was a high priest. He was someone who's sanctified, holy of holies. Technically, he has to be careful not to rub shoulders too much with the people when he's in service because he can't become impure. And he has incredible tasks, and he's someone who has to obviously be deeply devoted and focused and and spiritually oriented and so on and so forth. So this seems contrary to the person who gets his shoes dirty and his hands muddy, in dealing with everyone's issues. So we say
the President of the United States takes time out from his busy schedule to help two meals make up to each other.
right, and that's exactly the point. That be of the students of Aaron, which means to say there's nothing more important than peace within the Jewish people. And not just the Jewish people. We find that Shammai was quite strict with this convert who came to him and said, teach me everything standing on one foot, and two other converts too in that piece of Talmud. And Hillel's the one who was patient with them and sort of explained to them the path that they needed to go. But the point is that Hillel is saying that it's not merely that Aaron should make peace, between Moses and Miriam. But Aaron understands there's nothing greater than the unity and the peace between the Jewish people, between husband and wife and so on. And therefore Aaron himself put aside his greatness, his isolation, his holiness, and all the important things he had to do, and said, you know what? The Holy of Holies is important, and the breastplate of the judgment is important, and the Mishkan is important, and being one with God is important, but the way we come most to God is by dealing with some spat between some husband and wife, in the furthest corner on the other side of the tracks of the encampment. That's the point. Now, not only is this Hillel's point, that Hillel was, of course, very humble and very concerned with everyone. Ironically, the one who says it, this was one of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's big things, where he argued that in a time such as today, it's not sufficient, to have outreach experts, but everyone needs to concern themselves. Even he says, if you're the greatest scholar and there's some kid down the street who doesn't know aleph beis, you have to put aside your scholarship and learn with that kid aleph beis, because that's the kind of generation we live in. And as you mentioned, Hillel did live in a tumultuous generation. But the point was, was not that so much we need a figure as we need to demonstrate that these basic concerns of unity and healing breaches between people are so central to Judaism that they're the worthy activity of the greatest of the great, of the holiest of the holiest. So there isn't, Yom Kippur, the Holy of Holies, is great, but it's not as important as bringing peace between people and creating a sense of harmony. And you see this from the last two statements. Ohev et habriot, he literally loved the creations. So the Reb Shner Zalman of Liadi, the author of the Tanya, makes the remark that this means to say that you're dealing with someone who you can't find anything good to say about the person other than God created them. You're dealing with someone who is unrefined and undeveloped and may have very negative personality characteristics. But he says Aaron was V'Sabriyo. He loved those people who the primary praise you can say about them is not that they worked on themselves and not that they developed any skills, but God made them. And but that's exactly the point. Because God made them, because God made them, like this kid's T-shirt that used to go common in the 70s, that said, "I know I'm special because God don't make no junk." And this is of course the point. This is exactly the point. That the fact that God created someone means that they are a irreducible, fundamentally necessary part of God's plan. And if that person isn't doing something to contribute, that's your responsibility to do what you can to develop them as you can. But love is not quid pro quo. Love is not doesn't say activate the briot, it says love them. In other words, if you love someone and appreciate them and show that you truly believe that they have potential, then they'll find their way alone. It's not you telling people what to do doesn't help because the person is a bria. He's not ready to hear, he's not developed to hear. But loving him or her, in other words, appreciating them, demonstrating that you genuinely respect them, because love and respect come together, that's the way to develop them. And last of all, makarvam the Torah, bringing them close to the Torah, means to say that there's often a temptation to attempt to adjust the Torah, to take bits and pieces off it, to make it more lenient and easier in order that the assumption being that people can't handle the Torah in its full form. But if we dilute it, that will somehow enable them to relate to it, at least at that level. So we say bring them close to the Torah. Don't bring the Torah close to them. And the idea is that a person may not do everything, but you don't change the everything. Over time, you change what the person does. You don't change the mark. You don't change the goal. You merely seek to get the person to change themselves. And this is really important, because if you really love people and you really care about them and you see that they want to engage in the Jewish community, but they say, this is way beyond me, the temptation is to say, okay, let's create a more diluted, diffuse, less demanding version of Judaism. So we say, no, let's love the person, accept that they may not reach the bar, and as far as God is concerned, that may be fine for them because that's where they are, but don't ever change the bar where it is. Why? Because the moment you do that, you take away in essence, the value of the Torah, which is that it's unchangeable and immutable and something worth aspiring to. If it's fungible, it's not worth aspiring to. And that's so. And once again, you see this characteristic. You see this characteristic with Aaron, that Aaron maintained his holiness. He didn't stop being the high priest. He didn't stop being who he was. He merely ensured that who he was able to relate to the people and work with them. Another important aspect of this is that one would have to ask the question about the first two clauses in reverse. Since pursuing peace is greater than loving peace, why is loving peace important? Loving people, the creatures, we understand. But why is loving peace important? I'm already talking about pursuing peace, which demonstrates not only do you love it so much, you're willing to pursue it. So why do we have to, since the mission is sparing with its words, why do we have to include loving peace?
Does this go back to what you were saying, not expecting quid pro quo, expecting something in return, whether it's loving your fellow Jew or loving family?
That's a possibility, yeah. And it's a very, very good a possibility. Any other thoughts?
Shalom Bayit. Is there a connection with Rabbi Akiva?
With regards, does that clog a little bit? I mean, this is something we'll see. This is something he says.
He says another version. Hillel says another version.
Right. So it's not in the Pirke Avot, it's in Tractate Shabbat. But it seems to me that loving peace and pursuing peace is similar to something the Lubavitcher Rebbe once said about the fact that Jews are Rahmanim. There are three characteristics of Jews, it says in the top, three general characteristics that Jewish people have and pride themselves on and so on, And those are, Baishanim, they're bashful, Rahmanim, compassionate, V'gom lechasadim, and doer of goods of doing deeds of kindness. So the question is, if you do deeds of kindness, which means you're doing them because of kindness, why do we also have to include compassionate? If we say compassionate, it's obvious that you could be compassionate, your heart could bleed, you don't do anything about it, you feel very bad, you don't actually get off your hinton and do anything about it. But once you're already doing good, why that would include compassion. So the Rebbe made the point that often when we see a person in trouble with sorrow that we can't do anything about, we can't help them, what happens is we end up giving up. In other words, we stop thinking about them. We can't help them. We feel bad. We don't want to deal with the pain. So we just, let go of it. So he says that sometime that's only true if you're pragmatic. You have an obligation to help others. You feel bad if you can't, and that's it. You can't help, so you move on with your life. But if you truly love someone, it doesn't make a difference that you can't help. It bothers you because you see yourself as part of that person. You share something with them. So it's not enough to do deeds of kindness. You also have to be compassionate. That even if you can't help, you genuinely have to feel, and you can't help feeling because you see your fellow as someone who really is part of the same entity as you. It's family, it's part of you, You might not be able to do anything about your bruised hand, but it still hurts, and you're still going to think about your bruised hand. So too for the other. So it seems to me that we can build on this idea over here too, that sometimes all your efforts to make peace don't succeed. So you say, look, this is hopeless. These people are just going to keep fighting with each other, and that's that, right? So we say, no. Ohev shalom, love peace. The lack of peace should bother you intrinsically because you see this lack of peace between these two people as intrinsically straining and shattering your community, your equilibrium, and so on. You shouldn't but help but be pained by it, even though you can't do anything about it. This is not an obligation. This is an existential experience. And so that is why we have to say both. Okay.
Does it relate to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
It's a little bit like the elephant in the Jewish question. Someone's giving a lecture on elephants, to the new immigrants in the Lower East Side. So someone says, what do elephants have to do with the Jewish problem? And, to a certain extent, almost everything. So there are several issues over here. The first is that this intense sense of identification this familial sense of identification may only be realistically possible within the Jewish community. In other words, we may be cousins with everyone else, but ultimately, you need at least potentially a common essence, a common self. That's first of all. That being said, we see from this case that we're dealing with Hillel, and Hillel, not just with the converts, but in general, Hillel was someone who's compassionate and concerned. Clearly, there are many stories clearly extended outside the Jewish community. But once again, it should bother you if you can't have peace, but sometimes you can't get it. Remember, peace means a state of harmony between two people or two groups of people who don't hurt each other. It doesn't mean that I won't hurt you if you give me something. To make a long story short, it certainly should bother us, that you don't have this, but but obviously to attain a promise of peace based not on love, but on unsustainable concessions is obviously not a way to go, because that's simply extortion in some other way. So what I'm saying is that this has no bearing on policy, it has bearing on how we should feel. It should bother us that there's a people raised in such hatred that they're unable to live in harmony with other human beings. But that certainly shouldn't affect policy in any way, because your love of your fellow doesn't extend to suicide. And I would say that would be the core response. That being said, where you are capable of where people show their willingness to live with you in peace, you certainly should extend the capacity to give them equal protection of the law, benefits, and so on and so forth, provided they're not out to get you. As the Talmud reminds us, that we live in a community, and there are people, not just Jews, but other people, that when we give charity, we have to benefit the others with you, the others, with the Jews. We can't make a distinction. So that I think that's how it applies. But it doesn't make sense to say that this desire should somehow fundamentally change policy that is based on a sense of what is, how do I put it, sensible. Anyways, so moving on to the next Mishnah. Hu ha-Omer, whatever it says hu ha-Omer, it's the same person as before, so Hillel. And Hillel, as we see, was a real nice guy, but Hillel was perfectly willing to be tough where necessary. So he warns us as follows: Nagad Shema, Avad Shema. He who chases fame loses fame. If you do things solely for, shall we say, the approbation of others, you will lose your fame, because A, they'll see through you, and B, the person who seeks rulership and importance, God tends to remove it from him. Udullah Mosef Yosef, someone who doesn't keep adding to his study, Yosef, he will lose, it will be gathered away. In Hebrew, to Mosef means Lo Yosef can mean he didn't stop, or he didn't begin, he no longer did it. It could, in other words, so the Lo Mosef, he who doesn't add, Yosef will, as if it were, have the words gathered away from you. So if you don't acquire more, it gets acquired away from you. The study. A person has to keep studying, and you can't rely on what you know. Udullah Yalif Ketolah Chayav. And someone, Udullah Yalif, and someone who does not bother to study, Ketolah Chayav, he is liable to death. Which means to say that what's the point of living? Someone who doesn't study Torah, someone who doesn't seek to improve themselves, in which the beginning of all self-improvement is knowledge, both of ideas and oneself. So if you don't study, Yalef, by the way, is reflexive, so it means not just to study, but to have the Torah teach you. But if you don't make the effort to grow, why are you living another day? If I'm not making, if a person, in other words, the person, should live till be 120, but it's not life, because you're not growing. And life is about doing something with the space that a person is breathing and so on, not merely, absorbing oxygen and giving out carbon dioxide, I should say. Ulishtamesh b'taga cholav, and the one who uses the crown of the Torah, the one who uses his knowledge of Torah and communal position for their own benefit, will pass on, which means to say that they will not maintain their position, they will not maintain their existence. So there's two issues. One is one should not pursue fame for its own sake, but in other words, but even if you acquired respect justly and properly, and it wasn't a negative pursuit, if you then are tempted to use it for your own ulterior motives, so then that's also destructive. So Hillel's basic point over here is that on one hand a person needs to study and needs to be ambitious in their study and seek to grow. But if one's ambition is a product of a desire for approbation by others, or if once one acquires that knowledge, however honestly, you realize that you can use it for your own gain, for ulterior motives, so that's really not a lot better than not studying at all. And Hillel's making the argument here that it's necessary both to acquire knowledge of Torah and to seek to benefit the community, but genuinely as an end in itself, not as an end for the things people usually seek. The stuff you seek, usually get it the regular way, but the Torah should not be a vehicle for it. It says in the Talmud that a man should better flay a carcass in the street and not say, I am a great man, feed me. Hu haya omer, Hillel used to say, Im einani li mili, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Ukasha'ani la'atzmi, and if I am for myself, ma'ani, what am I? Ve'im lo achshav, and if not now, ein masai when. This is very, very famous, and there actually are several ways of looking at it. So the simple one is that if I'm not going to make the effort to do what's right, no one is going to do it for me. No one is going to give me the merits of the Torah study or mitzvot on my own. But at the same time, ukashani la'atzmi, if I assume I take credit for this, what am I worth? Because compared to what I ought to do, this is a drop in the bucket. And if not now, when? Which means to say there's no later. Because whatever reason you find to be putting off something valuable, a mitzvah, the study of Torah today, you'll find a reason to put it off tomorrow. The opportunity comes, do it, because if you're in a state of procrastination, you will permanently procrastinate. There's no time but now. In other interpretations, if I'm not for me, who will be for me? In other words, if I don't take the responsibility to lead and to do what needs to be done, so who will do it for me? If there's something that you say, oh, we need something in the community, well, maybe you're the one to do it. But on the other hand, if I am to myself, in other words, if I only engage in those things that I see a direct benefit to me, what am I? Another interpretation, everyone needs to do all the stuff we talked about in the last Mishnah, oneself. This is Rabbi Trevor's interpretation. Everyone needs to do all the, pursuing peace. You got to do it yourself, because who else is going to do it for you? But at the same time, if I'm for myself, what am I? In other words, you got to work with other people. It's true that you need to work, and you need to make things happen, and all the loving peace and pursuing peace won't happen without you. But don't do it on your own, because there's other people in the community, and work with them. But at the same time, if other people aren't available, then just go do it. You must work, you must involve others, but don't wait if they're not ready. Because if they're not ready today, they probably won't be ready tomorrow. The same thing applies to you. Okay. Now let's meet now does anyone have any, there's a very famous piece, this is Avot for me. Anyone have any further comments on this concept?
This would apply to Torah study, for example,
Yeah,
making a fixed time.
right, so that's Shammai, that's next. Okay, so now we move on to Hillel's compatriot Shammai.
But it doesn't really talk about the Torah study here, does it? It says in general.
Right, correct. It's about everything. It's about Torah study, it's about mitzvot, it's about making peace. Hillel talked about Torah study, Hillel talked about making peace. And now he's saying that in all these activities, you have to be the one to do it. You should involve others, but don't wait for yourself or anyone. Shammai says, and there's, by the way, one other interpretation, that a person can't say I'm insignificant because God didn't, we said earlier, make anyone insignificant. But at the same time, a person can say I'm so significant that I don't have to pay attention to anyone else's opinion. So let your voice be heard, but listen to other people too. If I'm not for myself, if I don't speak up and make my voice be heard, what am I? But if I only listen to my voice and no one else's voice, that's not a good thing either. And that's one more interpretation. Shammai says, now we get to Hillel's compatriot Shammai. He says, Asay Torah Chakva, make your Torah fixed. In other words, you need to have a fixed time to study Torah, and all the other stuff, whatever you need to do, your appointments, your errands, your work, fit it around that. Because since Torah isn't necessary for survival, it will always get pushed off between taking the kids to the doctor and going to work and getting your tires fixed, whatever it is that people do with their lives. So you have to make a fixed time for Torah that's immutable, because it's not something that the physical body and the physical world consistently demand of you. Always push it off everything else because it's not necessary for the body. Therefore, you have to make an extra firmness that no matter what, the time to come to study Torah, that's it, that time is blocked out. Because otherwise, you won't end up doing it at all. Amor ma'at v'asei harbe. Speak little and do much. Which means always do more than you promised. And in general, speak as much as you need to get the thing going. But the Shammai is also saying don't overly analyze it. In other words, what does it mean say little and do much? Don't start worrying about every detail to the point where you have to negotiate everything to be perfect. Something needs to be done, get up and do it. And don't get caught up in the discussion, because discussion is about your ego, the doing is about what you're doing for others. Last of all, harbe is literally always do more than you promised. Make a commitment that seems reasonable, then try to strive over it rather than promising people the moon and then doing nothing. V'havei mekabel es kol adam b'sever panim yafes. Receive every person with a pleasant countenance. In other words, even though Shammai is this very focused, driven kind of person, and Shammai is telling us to be very focused, organized, driven kind of person, always receive everyone pleasantly. In other words, don't make your relationship to others dependent on their living up to your standards. Greet everyone pleasantly, and the only way to do that is to be genuinely happy to see them. But also it means that you should have the ability to be pleasant to others. Sever panim yafes, the face is the outside. But even if you're tumultuous inside, even if you're having a hard time, don't take that out on the other person. In other words, try to be pleasant even if you're not feeling pleasant inside, because that person, you have your issues, they have theirs. But the point is that your countenance, your public face, that belongs to everyone else. And the idea is that you should have room for the other person to be pleasant to them, even though you're consumed with your own troubles. Don't let your own troubles so consume you that you don't have a sense of appreciation and kindness to the other person. And this is important because Shammai's big thing was that he demanded absolute consistency, that the inside be like the outside, that the person only, that we only take students who are worthy and, who are ready to live up to everything they study. So Shammai was very demanding of complete consistency. But he says that doesn't include that you approach other people with sort of where you're holding. There you have to be pleasant. In other words, your how do I put it? Harsh consistency ends with yourself. It's not your job to apply that to others. So however down you are on yourself, don't show a negative face to another person. So now we get to after the Sanhedrin is moved away from the Tabor of the hewn stone in the temple. So the Sanhedrin convenes in Yavne, and that's where Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai saved it at the time of the Roman destruction of the temple. But now you no longer had the formal Sanhedrin, so you no longer had the same authority to the leader and the Abed, and instead what was left of the Sanhedrin followed Hillel's descendants. So from here on in we have one leader. So Rabbi Gamliel, who was the very first Rabbi Gamliel the first, the son of Hillel, who would have lived through the destruction of the temple as his son Shimon did, the first Shimon. It's basically what you have is you have Hillel, Gamliel, Shimon, right? And then you have again Shimon's son Gamliel, who's the one who got deposed from his position for a while, his son Shimon, and Rabbi Yehuda, who was the son of Rabbi Shimon. So if we count from Hillel, the first generation is Hillel, Rabbi Gamliel the first, Rabbi Shimon the first, followed by Gamliel the second, Rabbi Shimon the second. And Rabbi Shimon the second son was Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who was the leader of the Sanhedrin, what was left of it, and the one who authored the Mishnah. And Gamliel the third is already one of the rabbis of the Israeli Talmud. So because they're all Shimon, and so basically you have like five Rabbi Gamliels and four Rabbi Shimons. So it's important to know who we're talking about. So this is Rabbi Gamliel the first, Hillel's son. And this is we're down to one because again we no longer have the full functioning Sanhedrin. So Rabbi Gamliel Haya Omer, Rabbi Gamliel says, Hasei lecha Rav, make yourself a master. In other words, ensure that you have someone who you follow, who you learn from consistently, who you ask your questions. So say means to make, because you don't want to look for the person who'll tell you what you want to hear. You accept someone because they demonstrate they're worthy of authority, and then, as long as you're a student and they know more than you, you become a student, you become a disciple, and you obey them. Not where they go against what they themselves taught you, but you accept that there's someone who knows more and someone who is a leader, and you become a disciple and you follow. And you don't simply rule for yourself as long as there's someone who knows more than you out there. And vestalik min hasafek means keep away from doubts. In other words, attempt not to put yourself, he's mostly talking to his students, to the other rabbis. Don't put yourself in a position of doubt. In other words, where you don't have the information to decide what's right. In other words, try not to set up situations where you're going to have a lot of doubt. In other words, try to educate your students. It's very interesting, this idea. Now, to educate your students in such a way that they're very clear on what ought to be done and how to do it, so they're not fuzzy, so they're not always doubting. Then you're going to have to come in and clean up the mess and deal with the doubts. Keep away from doubts. Try to be clear. Try to explain things in a way people can understand. Try to make sure that they have a very clear sense of what the halacha is, and not vague ideas that are constantly leading to questions and doubts. So it's about teaching. You get yourself a teacher. What kind of teacher should you be? The person who doesn't teach doubts, who doesn't teach fuzzy, who doesn't teach ways of doing things or ways of understanding things that leave people always wondering what to do because you weren't clear, you weren't precise, you weren't exact. The al tarba la aser umodus, and do not, when you take your tithes, even though it's okay to, on occasion, if you don't have the right equipment to measure by rough estimation, don't do this too often. Make this a accident. Have the right equipment, and take your tithes very precisely. And what he's saying, and this is of course related to this idea of avoiding doubts. His point being that it's really a matter of preparation. When you go out to your fields and when you harvest your crops, you're ready to measure, you do it. You measure. In other words, don't be unprepared. It's the same thing with teaching. He's saying that make sure you have the right equipment. Make sure you understand your students and what they need to know to learn. And he uses this tithing as an example of what teaching ought to be. Because if you come prepared, you'll be fine.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Back in number 6, the Roshua on Paracha uses the same words.
Asay l'charav. Yes.
Is the concept,
So the question is this the same concept or a different one?
or is he showing respect for the other one?
It's a very interesting question.
What's the question again?
So
We said exactly the same thing.
same words are used in number
Yeah.
6, for except the future. Sometimes,
Okay, number 6 and the second
Starts
one
with the same.
and number 6
is the same as 16.
Yeah, same one.
Oh, sorry, hold on. Here, I got another commentary here, one moment. Let me just find this one. It's a good question, let me see, because my commentary is in front of me, but we got a Mishnah here, hold on. Let's look it up and see. Okay, what Mishnah are we up to?
16. So, 6 and 16.
Number 6 was possible.
My mistake, by the way. Rabbi Gamliel is Hillel's grandson. There was a Shimon before. There was a Shimon before Rabbi Gamliel. So Hillel dies about the year 30 or 40. So Rabbi Gamliel would be a young man. Well, actually, no, so he was probably in his 20s already, so he was in his 40s or 50s when the temple was destroyed. But there is one more generation in between. Okay. One second. So, Mishnah 16. So the question is, why do we have a Seil Charav twice in one chapter? It's a good question.
Well, it's similar, but it's also different.
How is it different?
No, phrasing is exactly the same.
Okay.
At least in the
Okay,
translation.
I'm looking at the translation. Translation is different.
Really? I have the same translation.
Really?
It's the same Hebrew word.
Okay, I have a 6, it's translated as provide yourself with a teacher, get yourself a companion.
No, I mean, the first, provide yourself with a teacher.
What does he say?
Yeah.
Just
and
like-
What is
That's
translated here?
Here, the commentary says that one is for Torah study and one is for halacha.
Right, and that's the Bartanura, but the Bartanura says, here we're talking about that if you're busy judging the case and you don't know the answer, don't wing it, get someone else. The problem with that is, the Bartanura is the Bartanura, but the problem is then we should give some hint that it's a separate thing. So I would say it's as follows. I feel that we have to look at this historically. You notice it doesn't, what doesn't it say? Till now we said received, received, received. This is the first one, it doesn't say received.
Except-
Why? No, just as Rabbi Gamliel said. Why? Because there was a single unitary train of transmission until Hillel and Shammai. Because all debates were voted on in the Sanhedrin and solved. So when I say Asay L'Charav in a generation where pretty much everyone says the same thing, it's pretty easy. Because Asay L'Charav, there's a hierarchy in the Sanhedrin, so you choose someone who's ahead of you in the hierarchy. You know, every Sanhedrin had 3 rows. There was a Sanhedrin of the Temple Mount, and a Sanhedrin of the gates, and a Sanhedrin of each tribe, and in each town there were 3 rows of students. So you go to a person who's above you in the hierarchy, and you study from him. But now, all of a sudden, from the time of Hillel and Shammai, the Sanhedrin is disbanded. There is no single body making decisions. The Jews, people gather in various schools and academies. All of a sudden, you have a great deal of machloket, a great deal of debate and disputation. So now, you can't just say, you don't have a linear hierarchy anymore. You can't go say, find someone above you. Because there's lots of hierarchies. So what do you do? So he says, nevertheless, Asay L'Charav. Even though there are many schools of thought, don't jump around, don't go ruling shopping. In other words, jumping from opinion to opinion, from teacher to map, whatever feels best to you and whatever goes to you. Choose an opinion, choose a path, choose a school, and make yourself a Rav. Even though it's not the same as before, because it's not slotted into hierarchy, you don't have a single truth, you have multiple truths. Now, these are the words of the living God, still make a Rav. Because a person could say, now in this new situation, what's the point of making myself a Rav? I'm not going to be connected to an absolute hierarchy where we know that there's only one answer. How do I know I have the right answer? We say, nevertheless, find someone who works for you, because the worst thing is for you to trust yourself. Trust someone else, even though others might have a different opinion, that's fine. But don't trust yourself when there are others who are more learned than you, even though they themselves are disputing with each other. So the Asay L'Charav in the first Mishnahs is a very, very different reality than in the second, than in Rabbi Gamliel's case. Rabbi Gamliel is saying, you know what, everything changed, but still Asay L'Charav. Still find a school of thought and follow it.
So all the more so because there's more uncertainty? So-
Right, but even in uncertainty, because the point is you're not getting a Rav who everyone agrees is a Rav. Before I choose someone, everyone agrees that he's in line, right? He's a member of the Sanhedrin. He's part of this hierarchy, he has a position in it, and everyone agrees that he's right about what he knows, and he asks the one above him. Now we don't even agree, right, who's right, who represents the true path of the halacha. But that's fine, still make for yourself a Rav. So if you understand the history, the Asay L'Charav of Rabbi Gamliel and the Asay L'Charav earlier is a completely different Asay L'Charav. Yes?
On what basis do you assume yourself a master?
on the basis of your resonating with that person, your ability to learn from them, the sense that you feel that this person is of good character and greater knowledge than you, someone who you respect and who you are able to learn from and are inspired by. But once you make that person your Rav, you have to listen even if you don't agree. You can make your arguments, but the point is that if you feel differently, you still have to follow. That you have to find the person who works for you. In the past, you could sort of choose anyone, as long as they're above you in the hierarchy. Now you have to find someone who you resonate with, you can learn from, because there isn't an absolute hierarchy anymore.
Are you saying that when the temple, before destruction of the temple, there was no disagreement between?
Not before the destruction of the temple. During the time of Hillel and Shammai, until then, all debates, we only know of very few debates from that time period, because almost all debates were resolved. They went from Sanhedrin to Sanhedrin, like up to the Supreme Court, and the Sanhedrin of 71 who sat in the temple solved the problem. They answered the problem. They voted, and the majority vote ruled, and the ruling didn't say 26 rabbis said this and 40 rabbis said that. It just said this is what the Sanhedrin ruled. You weren't allowed to reveal it. So there was a unitary tradition pretty much until the Sanhedrin was no longer in its place, at which point it no longer had the authority to vote and decide, plus they were scattered in different places, so it only became a majority of all the rabbis. So on several occasions, between then and the closing of the Talmud, the majority of the rabbis gathered together and came to certain conclusions. But it was an ongoing basis, otherwise, and some debates weren't resolved. There are debates that continue through the Mishnah, through the Talmud, into our day. Some of them.
But Hillel and Shammai, as we know.
They had very few debates, and all those debates took place after the Sanhedrin was exiled. Their students, Bet Hillel, Bet Shammai, had very many debates because the Sanhedrin was no longer functioning. And the Sanhedrin sort of gave up its authority, A, because they didn't want to be manipulated by the Romans, Herod and later the Romans, and B, because there was a sense that they weren't being listened to. And it's sort of worse if you have an authority that isn't obeyed than if you don't have an authority at all. Because the authority not being obeyed completely sort of negates people's appreciation of it, whereas the hope was that if they say, look, we're only going to be there when we're an authority, that ultimately their authority would be returned. Now, one other point about avoiding doubts. That part of avoiding doubts is if you rule all by yourself, people always doubt if you were for real, if you really made the right ruling. If you consult others, so then there's a much stronger sense that your ruling was valid because others concurred. Because everyone can make a mistake at any time. It's unlikely, unless one is influencing the others, for several to make the same mistake at the same time. Now, Shimon, the son of Rabbi Gamliel, was one of the martyrs who was executed by the Roman government after the destruction of the first temple, before Bar Kokhba, actually. What? So this is Shimon. Well, this is Shimon the second. He's the first mentioned here, but he's the second. Hillel, Shimon, Gamliel, Shimon. So this is Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who was the father. So this is Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel the second. Well, it's the first Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, but it's the second Rabbi Shimon the second. So Shimon ben No, he's the father of Rebbe, who writes the Mishnah. So actually, So Rabbi Gamliel, so this Rabbi Gamliel, the elder, lives through the destruction of the temple. This Rabbi Shimon is probably born around that time. He's about 70 when he dies. So he's probably, we're talking around the year, yeah. So he dies after the Bar Kokhba revolt, actually. Because his son was born, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wrote the Mishnah about the year 200 or so. So this, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel was killed after Bar Kokhba. His father lived through the first revolution, him through the second. So anyway, so Rabbi Shimon, his son, who dies at about between 135 and 140, so we assume was born about the time of the destruction of the temple, maybe a bit earlier. So he says, Kol Yomai, all my years, Gadalti Bein HaChachamim, I grew up among the sages. Because from a very little child, this was the leader, this was the Nasi, the leader of the Jewish community, the leader of the academy. So I grew up my whole life among the sages. Like Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik, of blessed memory from Chicago, said that his first words, because his crib was in the room where everyone got together to study, says the first words he said weren't, daddy or mommy, but were the Rambam is schwer. This piece of Rambam is difficult, because that's what he heard everyone constantly say. So Shimon his son says, Kol Yomai, Gadalti Bein HaChachamim. All my days I grew up among the wise ones. V'lo matzasi l'guf tov mishtika. And I didn't find anything better for a person than quiet, than quiet. In other words, the idea of quiet, by the way, wine, it says shoked al shmarav, it's quiet on its lees, right? You put it back. When wine ferments and you age it, you leave it so the lees settle out, right? So that's shoked. In other words, it's not just being quiet, but being quiet in such a way that the junk gets separated from the good stuff. So too, quiet indicates not just being quiet, but listening. In other words, mouth shut, ears open. So I didn't find anything better than quiet. And teaching is not the main thing, but action. In other words, all the discussion is fine, but it has to bring to action. So ultimately, that means you can discuss the halacha all you want, or not all you want, but you have to come to a conclusion. And any idea you learn should bring to some practical result. Whoever speaks too much brings sin. And the Rambam, Maimonides has an interesting take on this. Maimonides says this is about a teacher. It's not in general. In general, talking too much brings sin because you end up speaking slander, lashon hara, and so on. But the Rambam says it's about a teacher. It's sort of like the earlier Mishnah. So he says if you're abundant in words, you bring sin. If when you teach halacha to your students, you speak too much and you give them too much detail, or you explain it in too verbose and imprecise a way, they will sin, they will do the wrong thing. So whoever is abundant in words, whoever is verbose, because they didn't prepare, brings sin. Now, one other thing over here. Why does it say the body? There's nothing better for the body than silence. And the idea is that the silence, which means to say the negation of the ego. In other words, where does the evil inclination prop up if you hang around the sages? If you hang around the sages in Torah study, where does the evil inclination come up? In arrogance, in ego, in this desire to be right and to prove others wrong. So I say, calm down. There's nothing better for the body, in other words, for negating the negative propensities of the body, of the evil inclination, than silence. In other words, if you don't give in to your desire to be always heard, you're better off. Okay. There's another interpretation of Chol Omar B'Devarim, maybe Chay, means don't add things to make a point in the danger that people will then assume what you added is primary and the primary is secondary. There's a danger in teaching people stuff about Torah, about halacha in particular, that for example you dwell so much on the details of some minor point that they completely miss the major point. A friend of mine had a Judaica shop in Los Angeles many years ago, and he told me how one day someone shows up at his door right before Shabbos and says, my wife just gave her and need, the Shir Hamalot, that little paper with the Shir Hamalot of various Kabbalistic things written on. I need a Shir Hamalot. He says, I can't go back to the store now, it's almost Shabbos. So he says, what do you mean? Because of your silly superstitions, my wife shouldn't have a Shir Hamalot? And of course the point is that clearly this person was educated about the importance of Shir Hamalot, but not about the details of observing Shabbat. And this is called a marbi devar me'bichet, that if you give over too much information, don't differentiate between the relative value of the information, you're going to have a problem. And we find this. The Bar Tanura says you find this with Chava, where Hashem spoke to Adam and he told him to give it over to Chava. The next time around, when the Torah is given, God tells Moses to speak to the women first, because of what happened the first time. So they spoke to Adam, and Adam messed up because he told Chava, he starts saying, Chava, this tree, should anything do with this tree, don't eat this tree, and don't even touch the tree. So the snake convinces her to touch the tree, and nothing happens, so he says, you see, you could eat from the tree too. And so because Adam added things he ought not to have added, and didn't differentiate between and he said, listen, Chava, it's better if you don't touch the tree, because then maybe you'll touch the fruit, and maybe you want to eat it. Instead, he just sort of gave her all this information without differentiation, which brought to, almost 6,000 years of a detour from perfection. So the point is don't call a marba devara me'bichet. You cause people to sin if you give them many things to observe. Here, devara means not words so much as items. Give them too many items and don't differentiate, don't clarify what's the law and what's the custom, what's mandatory and what's ideal. You end up with people who are worried about the Shir Hamalot but aren't sure that it's a bit, what Shabbat's about. So one has to be extraordinarily careful. And now why is this significant historically, which I will conclude with this idea. It's significant historically as follows. Because obviously Shimon is growing up between the first and second destructions, he's a leader, between the destruction of the temple and the Bar Kokhba revolt. It's in extremely tumultuous times, and the normal study is not happening. So he says, listen, you don't know if you'll finish educating people. So be very careful, because whatever you give over, that might be what they have. And if you're not clear, and you're not precise, and you're not differentiating, for all you know, these kids won't go to school tomorrow. These adults won't hear any Torah for a long time. So in such uncertain times, it's all the more so important not to mess things up, because you might not have the opportunity to fix them later. So I wish you all a good Shabbos. We'll attempt to get a hold of Sergei.
But it sounds like a fence around the law.
It says to Chava, or Chava said to serpent about there.
Adam said to Chava, and Chava said to the serpent.
I think just Chava.
Oh, we don't, no. Chava says to the serpent, but the Midrash tells us that the Chava got the idea from Adam.
Oh, it's Midrash, but it's not from the text. Because
No. Well, but the Midrash is obvious. Midrash wants to know where did she get the idea from, right?
No, they just think the idea is not always from their husbands.
No, but someone had to tell her, because God didn't speak. God didn't speak to her directly. God only spoke to Adam. It says it, because God spoke to Adam before he split Adam into Adam and Chava. So Adam's the only one who heard it. That's clear. The Midrash is actually, it's actually wants to know, when would Chava have heard it. So the only one she could have heard it from is Adam, because God doesn't speak to Chava till later.
I have a question about the fence around the law. I mean,
Yeah.
we have a lot of fences around the law. So why, and you were speaking against it, so.
I wasn't speaking against it, I was saying we need to be clear. And in the case of Chava, there was no need for a fence. We talked about this actually a few weeks ago, that in the case of Chava, no fences were needed because you had a perfect world. In an imperfect world, you need fences. That being said, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel's point has nothing to do with fences, it has to do with being clear. It's fine to have fences, just make sure people know what's a fence and what's the law. There's a big difference between the two. But the question of Chava and fences has to do with the fact that because fences were unnecessary at the time, making them was detrimental.
Not everybody knows that what's the fence and what's the law.
Well, that's
Some people think that the
that
fence is the law.
That is precisely what Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is concerned with. Don't be so verbose and don't be so indistinct that people are not clear what each thing is. Yeah, exactly.
But
That's
no
what he's
one
worried
teaches
about.
it, right?
If it didn't happen, he wouldn't have to worry about it. What?
No one teaches it. For example, kids in schools, they're not.
I don't know. I taught high school. I always was very clear about what's what. When you teach the laws of Shabbat, you have to be clear. Everything. Okay, so thank you all very much. So we can close the recorders now. I don't know how to do it, but everyone can close all the recorders.